Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of PatristiCast. Happy Tuesday. Today, I am very delighted to welcome a friend of mine to the show, Pui Him Ip. Pui is a tutorial course director and research fellow at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion at Cambridge University. He's previously taught patristics at Cambridge, at the University of Oxford, and King's College London. Pui, welcome to PatristiCast.
Thank you for having me. It's a great delight to be here.
So today we're going to talk about your book. Oh, I got some light interference there. Origen and the Emergence of Divine Simplicity Before Nicaea. Just came out, University of Notre Dame Press. Before we get into that, I think I should share a story. The first time we met at the Oxford Patristics Conference a few years back, 2019, you were the chair of the session in which I was presenting a paper. There were a lot of people in there, and I was really nervous. This was outside of the North American Patristic Society. This is like the biggest conference I've been to at the time. And, you had like Lorenzo Perrone, Alphonse Fierst was in there, Margaret Mitchell. I can't remember some of the other big names that were in there, but I felt a little out of place. I had the imposter syndrome really percolating. And I have this distinct memory of, as I was going through my paper, probably about 10 minutes in, I was aware of the 12-minute thing where you ring the bell. And it must have been about 10 minutes in, and I saw your hand motion towards the bell, and I didn't know how long I'd been going, so I said, oh my god, I'm there already, I better wrap up. And I don't even know if you were moving towards the bell or not, but I skipped through a whole bunch and I just went straight to the conclusion, and I finished like, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes early. That was my first memory of you, Pui.
I remember that session very, very well, and I remember this impressive chap having read the latest Origen newly discovered homilies on the Psalms before everybody, and giving a wonderful exposition on, I think, the hearts. Was that
Purity of heart? Yep.
Purity of hearts. I remember that session very, very well.
Well, hopefully I won't be so nervous the next time around. So, Pui, before you got into patristics, you were in theoretical physics. What motivated or inspired the change? How did you find the Church Fathers?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. Thank you very much. I will be here all day. There is a long
Good
episode for the whole series. Well, I mean, one answer to give, which I think it's a easy to understand answer, is I was interested in studying theoretical physics because it was about the nature of reality. It was about how we understand what is there, and that was the kind of questions I asked when I was 16 and 17. I mean, yes, I was a pretty weird teenager. And honestly, I mean, I think after theoretical physics, I just got interested in questions about how theology tackles these questions. And especially I encountered a couple of writers who were pretty inspiring to me. They were figures, mostly 20th century theologians, sometimes connected to the term Jesusmon or neo-patristic synthesis in the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox world. And I read John Zizoulas, and I read Vladimir Lossky, and some of Balthasar and de Lubac's work, and they kind of inspire me to kind of recognize that theology has potentially really important contribution to these kind of questions. What is there? Is it a triune reality? Do we have a Trinitarian metaphysics that Christian over the centuries can develop and contribute to these discussions that we're having? Honestly, I mean, that is one way I would tell the story of how I kind of transition from theoretical physics and dealing with quantum mechanics and relativity mainly to questions about simplicity of God and Trinitarian theology.
Were you surprised when you first started reading some of the church fathers at just how much they talked about some of these questions? I mean, you can read commentaries on Genesis, and a lot of them are embedded with reflections on physics and the reality, the natural world.
I have to say, this is an interesting thing. So I think I often get asked this question. And I think people's assumption is that, well, as a physicist, you kind of keep an eye to these things, and then you kind of keep track of how the church fathers deal with like atoms and matter and things like that. I must confess, when I was a young student starting out around 2013 with no Greek and Latin and just read these texts, I was not spotting these things. I was kind of like, well, here's a new area of study. It's exciting. It's like new questions to think about, like what is the term ousia and hypostasis and relations and scriptural exegesis. I was spotting all these things, to be honest. And it's only really until very recently that I started thinking about matter and thinking about natural philosophy and motion more generally. So I wasn't spotting these things when I was a young student, which is an interesting, I think often I get asked this question.
No, but I actually kind of agree. It's when I read in the English translations, I don't really pick up on some of these discussions very much. But when you get into the original languages, like when I started reading Origen in Greek, I started picking up on a lot of these things a lot more. The language does matter quite a bit. And one of the, oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, one thing to add on this question, which probably answer your initial questions as well. I think from my point of view, my turn to patristics, what brought me to patristics is a sense that this ancient body of reflections from a Christian perspective, but with a kind of philosophical and cultural background coming with it. In Origen's case, Alexandrian culture and philosophy. This body of sources provide an exciting provide an exciting body of materials that come at some of these questions that modern philosophy, theology, and theoretical physics and the forefronts of science really are trying to address, and it comes with new conceptual categories or new, maybe forgotten conceptual categories. It comes with little disciplinary boundaries that we have to respect these days between philosophy and theology, or between science or reflection on nature and reflection on scripture. And I mean, these writers, they have new ways, for me, they have new ways to think about these questions that vitalize the whole current discussion. And so that's kind of what I was excited about, really, when I first get into this body of text and figures.
Well, it's borne a lot of fruit in this monograph that you just had published, in which you kind of trace the development of a very important concept, divine simplicity, before the Council of Nicaea, so before 325, where after which it really becomes a center point for a lot of theological reflection. But your book traces the development prior to that. I'm going to start with a quote here to get us going, if I can find it.
Right.
Quote, God is simple, without parts and composition, end quote. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 word, a 7-word definition right there of divine simplicity. What does it mean for God to be without parts and composition?
Well, that is why the book is needed, I guess. I remember when I first started the project, the leading figure in English scholarship, G.C. Steed, or Christopher Steed, who's written several articles on this, he repeats this point that the problem with simplicity is that it is not simple. It's
It is not.
I've got to say this in this podcast, right? If there's one place to do it, this is the reason why divine simplicity, God simplicity, is a fascinating subject, because it's not simple, and there you have it. The problem in a nutshell. I mean, God is simple. I mean, fundamentally, there are two ways in which I think about why this problem is important, at least for me, as I work on the book. The first problem has to do with how to reflect on this fundamental recognition in theology, or at least in monotheistic traditions, that there is a fundamental distinction between a divine being or a divine agent and created beings and created realities. And one way to think about it is to think about the fact that the God, this divine actor and being, is ontologically, metaphysically, and according to its own nature, a simple being that is not dependent. One way to think about it is it's entirely pure, entirely kind of self-reliant, entirely not requiring any additional external agent to maintain its life and its being. And that concept of simplicity, actually, I mean, if you don't talk about God, a lot of people intuitively understands this idea. In science or in mathematics, people talk about simplicity of theories, talk about simplicity of entities, building from simple entities like atoms and quarks to most complex entities. And in mathematics, of course, you have numbers, and that also was an ancient topic for simplicity. So this concept is quite common, but when it comes to God, it becomes non-trivial. And that brings me to the second part of why I come to this, right? Which is, for the Christian tradition believes in a God who is triune.
Yeah.
That is, according to the language of a Council of Nicaea and beyond, there's Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit that Christians affirm to be divine and one. And that sense in which God is three persons really creates a huge puzzle for thinking about what does it mean for God to be simple in a kind of sense that I've just described.
Yep.
Fundamental, not dependent, self-reliant. And that creates a kind of problematic that I try to sketch out at the beginning of the book.
Yeah, even before Nicaea, the earliest Christian practices, including baptism, were done with that Trinitarian formula. And then we have external evidence from Pliny the Younger, who was sent to investigate this Christian church in, where was it, Bithynia, I think, northern modern-day Turkey. And he says, these people aren't really a threat to the empire. They're kind of strange, and they sing hymns and they pray to this Christ as to a God. So even outsiders recognize that these Christians were doing something theologically a little bit different. And that right there was really the origin of a lot of these theological problems, because they had to face accusations of being polytheists because of these three persons.
We'll comment on this, I mean, as we go along, but I think you gave me you had a good phrase there that I wanted to comment on, because it's connected to why I think one of the main reasons why I wanted to write about divine simplicity in the context of Trinitarian theology. It's the idea of the kind of monotheism, or the kind of Christian philosophical theology, if you like. The kind of philosophical theology that was essential for Christians to articulate their own religious beliefs and practices to their audience. And that has some implications for modern context as well. We want to go into it at the end. We can talk about, but for Christians, it's a specific kind of monotheism that they they are articulating.
Mhm.
And that's why it constantly requires explanation, exegetical refinement from the Judaistic background that they come out of. It's constantly requires more and more conceptual and exegetical refinement to articulate this vision. And that's what I find so rich studying the subject of divine simplicity. That is one of the sites where this process is in full motion, and it develops and it continues beyond the period that I've studied into the 4th century and then into the 6th and 7th century and beyond. And you have more complex articulation in the Middle Ages. So I find this really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems to be the theological problem that has received solutions for 2 millennia, but the solutions, I don't know, is it, how to put this, are they unsatisfactory from one generation to the next? I mean, it seems like it's always a need of new formulations.
That's right. And one of the main motivations I had in giving the specific anti-Nicene, or have a restricted focus, historical focus on the book to this period of the first 3 centuries, almost 3 centuries of Christian reflections, is that the formulations beyond the 4th century is pretty well known in scholarship and has received a huge amount of attention ever since, I would say, probably around the 17th, 18th centuries. Even if you read some of the Protestant scholastics, they're very interested in the metaphysics of simplicity, as I think Stephen Duby in his book has shown recently. Yet the kind of initial reflections, especially the pre-Nicene reflections, before the formulations most people are familiar with in the post-Nicene context, before that, the pre-Nicene formulations actually have some really important insights that have rarely received treatments. We can go into the details a little bit later. And those insights raise some really interesting questions for me anyway, about how simplicity fits with Trinitarian theology, and then some bigger historiographical questions about how we narrate the development of Christian reflections. As you said, people just keep coming back and back and back again to these language of simplicity and Trinity. How do we deal with it today when philosophers of religion and systematicians today produce 2 or 3 or maybe even more papers on this problem every year, and seems to show no signs of reaching some sort of consensus? So that's that period of reflections, initial period of reflections, for me, it's neglected, has been neglected in previous scholarship, but also really has some exciting things to say.
Yeah, and one of the key points of your book, if not the key point, is really historiographical. Scholarship has tended to look at these anti-Nicene writings, anti-A-N-T-E, not anti-Nicene, anti-Nicene, through the lens of post-Nicene theological developments. So Origen, for example, writing in the middle of the 3rd century, is read through the lens of the Cappadocians, writing a century later. And your book is really an attempt to say that's historically inaccurate. We need to look at Origen's use of divine simplicity within the context of the theological problems he was grappling with a century before the Council of Nicaea, which I think is so important, because we can't, I mean, it's a historical fallacy to impose a later time period onto an earlier time period. But you also make the case that Christianity did not invent the concept of divine simplicity. So let's talk a little bit about that development. The locus classicus you articulate here is in the 2nd book of Plato's Republic. What is Socrates doing here with this concept?
Right. So I talk about the locus classicus in the book, and it's a kind of rhetorical device to get people to pay attention to this particular section in Plato's Republic, where famously Plato is getting Socrates to articulate a vision of education for those who are suitable, or to train up those who are suitable to take political leadership of the state. And so you have this program where these young men really are supposed to be trained in all kinds of intellectual training, with poetry, with language, with even religious literature and literacy, as well as music and physical training, etc. And so here in this section, in this key section of Plato's book 2, you find Socrates introducing some rules and reflecting on how what should these young men be subjected to, if you like, in terms of their religious literacy and how they understand what was going on in the domain of the gods. And obviously, this is in the context of a cultural background and historical location where there had been many different poetic and mythological traditions about how to communicate the lives of the gods and their interactions with mortals. So Socrates here are proposing some rules or some models to think about how to educate the religious minds, the religious literacy of these young men. And in this context, we find two important discussion, which is where I go into the point of simplicity, which is interesting in that it is also coupled with a very well-known rule or well-known principle for any students of Abrahamic religions, really, that the first rule is that God must be only associated with goodness, that is, with the good things and justice. And that rule is coupled with the second discussion in the same place in book 2, in the same discussion on the simplicity of the gods. And that's Socrates here is trying to lay down, if you like, what contemporary theologians might call the grammatical structure of theological discourse, the grammatical rules of how to understand what we mean when we go on to use the word God or divinity.
Yeah. So that's an important point that I wanted to highlight here. You bring this up in a couple of different ways. There's a grammar of theological speech, and there's patterns for theological speech. So what Socrates is doing, so he's got this world in which, like, the Iliad and the Odyssey are kind of the main mythological sources for stories about the gods and how they interact with people. And some of those stories are kind of absurd. Gods change forms. They do bad things. And he's saying, wait a second, is this a proper way to even speak about a god? We need to lay down some rules, some limits for what we can actually predicate to a god. And one of them is, can God do something that is not good, if God is goodness itself? And then the other thing is, can God change forms or change appearances, change forms? These are the two big things that Plato is getting at in the Republic here.
And so in this context, at the end of chapter 1, where I bring out these issues, I try to connect one way to think about why divine simplicity emerged in this Platonic context, in the Platonic project of building the ideal education of the state, of the education of the rulers, and some of the contemporary imbalance, in my view, of how we situate the topic of divine simplicity. So here's how I think about it. in Plato's discussion, and why I think this passage should be taken much more seriously as locus classicus, one reason to think about why simplicity of God, of not being able to change form and act in an entirely self-consistent way, is an important part of the overall program, is that Plato envisages a suitable, competent, morally or even intellectually, morally qualified ruler should also display such characters. In other words, the theology itself has a kind of role in formation, in the imagination of those who read theology. The kind of picture of gods that you work with will change the character of the reader, of the person. And so there is an intrinsic connection here. I say a few words here and there in the book, here in chapter 1, but also in chapter 5 and chapter 2 in Philo as well, that there's a recognition that the simplicity of God as a being that is not able or not even willing to change forms and be inconsistent or be acting in contrary ways, is a right model for how you form a human person who is suitable for certain endeavors.
Yes.
And that connection between formation and what I call ethical simplicity and the description, which eventually developed into a much more metaphysical, technical way in later writers, that connection, it's an important one, and I wanted to flag this up right at the beginning, that this context was read and understood almost, in my view, intuitively by many of the writers in the early Christian tradition. So that connection, in my view, is not well understood. And also in contemporary debates, where most scholarships have focused on the metaphysical technicalities about parts and Mariology. So that's one reason why I emphasize on this passage, this locus classicus.
Well, it seems to me that the ethical, because you bring up ethical and metaphysical simplicity, and in the Platonic tradition, that the ethical would simply make sense if we remember Plato's little axiom, that the end of human life is to become like God. And if you're going to become like a God, are you going to become like a God who continuously changes, is quite capricious, or a God who is steadfast through all circumstances and remains constant? So that ethical dimension of education is certainly, I think you're really onto something right there. And that, of course, will also impact Christianity, because Christianity talks about deification quite a bit. So what is this kind of God which we are supposed to become? It would seem to me that the ethical implications often get ignored in the scholarship in favor of the more metaphysical aspects of simplicity. And I think that's something that you bring out in your book.
Right. And I think one of the things, one of the follow-up research project that I'm slowly working through is to actually ask the question, is this a bigger thing, the connection between the simplicity of God, understood in a metaphysical sense, is the most basic, if you like, on which all things dependent, and the other sense, simplicity in an ethical sense, where to be simple is to be a kind of pure, to be a kind of, there is nothing that is mixed in terms of one's motives, and there's no internal conflicts, there's no inconsistencies amongst one's desires and one's life generally. Whether this marriage, the synthesis between the two senses of simplicity could be traced to in a wider way amongst mostly, I would say, Greek Christian writers after Origen. So I have in mind here more the kind of Cappadocian writers later in the 4th century, Evagrius in the 5th century, and even going all the way to Maximus later on. And I think that question I've only really scratched the surface here, but it really is an important part because, as you said, right, this Platonic project and has kind of been transformed in the Christian context. And one thing I did not say anything in the book, but I think really is worth future investigations is how does this connection change when the model of how simplicity being integrated in Trinitarian theological framework has shifted from the pre-Nicene era to the post-Nicene era. Does this vision of simplicity of the perfect life changes as well as the simple triune model of the simple triune God shifts from the kind of 3rd century Origenian model to a later post-Nicene model? That's really worth somebody to work on following these hints.
Well, I wonder if you can't see traces of that, of a conflict or a tension in the monastic tradition, in the Origenist controversy, especially in books 9 and 10 of Cashin's conferences, where it's the anthropomorphite controversy. It's, can we depict God in a human form in our prayer? This wasn't just some intellectual exercise. It got kind of violent between these monks. So I think that there would be fertile ground there to take a look at that question a little bit deeper.
Yes, I intend to get to the 5th century and beyond at some point. This is one of the big questions that has emerged from the book that I felt there was not enough space for it. The connection between ethical and metaphysical simplicity, and how it perhaps provides one way to understand the formation of a theologically grounded vision of perfection. It's the vision of perfection that it's grounded on the particular doctrine of God that Christians happen to ascribe themselves to. So yeah, one for future project.
Absolutely. And there's a development that takes place prior to Origen, which you do get at in your book. That is this period known as Middle Platonism, where Platonism is kind of being mingled with elements of Stoicism and Aristotle, where this simple God becomes the first principle. And you talk about a couple, Alcinous and Philo, the Hellenistic Jewish scholar, Alexandria. Say a thing or two, because this is pretty important, because certainly Philo, but also probably Alcinous, Origen was probably familiar with.
Absolutely. I think one reason why, I think the most important reason why I think this period serves as a very important background to the early Christian, the emergence of divine simplicity in early Christian discourse, is that I argue in the book that it's not obvious why one has to equate a monotheistic interpretation of God, one single entity, with the first principle of all things, the arche of all things. If you like, in high school theology, the first item in the chain of causation of all there is. It's not actually, I want to kind of flag up the point that with Plato's notion of simplicity, this is not necessary, nor is it obvious, even though, I mean, if you go to Republic later on, you look at the forms and you look at the analogy of the sun, the story does come together. And I do kind of drop hints about this within the Platonic tradition. There are rationale for this identification. But in this period, you find more discussions, still, I would say, not to be confused with the Christian understanding of God as the arche, but discussions that are eventually, it's moving in that direction.
Yep.
In Aquinas, you have a discussion, a chapter on God in the Didaskalikos, where you find more a kind of hierarchy, a metaphysical hierarchy, and you find more of the attributes that you tend to, the negative attributes, the alpha privatives that you find in Christian negative theology later on. You find that being attributed to a particular figure. And you find metaphysical consideration about partlessness being the most basic, inspired by the language of Plato's Parmenides, and you find discussions that really start to resemble the background of the terms that we often encounter in later Christian authors whenever they talk about divine simplicity. So you go to John of Damascus' summary of the doctrine of God, and then you find those technical terms, and where those terms come from in the Christian tradition. Well, for the very least, the Middle Platonic discussion is a very important part of that process of how they entered into Christian discourse. So I talked about that. I talked about how the kind of connections between simplicity of God and God's pure intellectuality can also be observed in Alcinous and some other Middle Platonic author, obviously also in Philo. God, this kind of pure noetic being, and that background in the story that I tell serves as a kind of transition, key transition point of how this concept of simplicity, which is, as I said in the Republic, mainly about the goodness of God and self-consistency, and it forms a kind of model for perfection, gets equipped by a very robust metaphysics of and mereology, which many contemporary authors have already explored. What is the meaning of being without parts and without composition? That takes us to mereology. We have to talk about the technicalities of distinguishing between different kinds of parts and different kinds of material parts, intellectual parts, real parts, potential parts. But before that, all these technicalities came along. There was simplicity as a concept. And so I wanted to show that this Middle Platonic period really does quite a lot of, shows us quite a lot of the development that was going on in that period.
You say that there was no reason to posit that the first principle was simple. And the Stoics, for them, there were two first principles, correct? There was the active principle, but then that active principle also needed a passive principle, which was matter. So that was kind of a competing vision, right? That would be like the a contrast to the divine simplicity.
There were also dualistic frameworks in that period. Gnostics.
Yes, system. That's right.
And I mean, these kind of discussions in my book, I simply did not have space to cover a much bigger discussion about how the simplicity of the first principle as a problem is really properly situated within the development of the period where Middle Platonism really is a too coherent a term. Rather, you have different visions of how to create a coherent metaphysics that integrates some features of Stoic philosophy and some features of Platonist philosophy and some terminologies of Aristotelian philosophy, traditionally called eclecticism. But Middle Platonism really is too coherent a term, because I mean, if you see discussion of Dylan, the classical discussion, or discussion more recently by Boystones in his Introduction to Middle Platonism volume, you find that even within Middle Platonism, there are debates about how many principles, you count 1 or 2 or 3, and whether there is a hierarchy between the principles. So I think my book really did not have enough space to do justice to those questions. But you're right in flagging that up. The idea of a pure, simple principle, which you will encounter in Origen, is much closer to a particular line that has been observed by many scholars, closer to the development of eventually moving towards Plotinus and Neoplatonism, which I do not deal with at all in the book. And I think that is only one particular development in this period. And I definitely think that there are others worthwhile developments in this period. And Christopher Steed, in his classic article, which I still think is very useful, Divine Simplicity as a Problem for Orthodoxy, he articulated multiple ways where haplous, the Greek word, or simplex, can be used in context where really it isn't just a pure simplicity with no mixture and composition and multiplicity completely. There are usages he identified in Tertullian and others where there could be the entity described as simple can also be involved in complexity or multiplicity in other contexts. So it's not it's not accurate to say that the vision I've sketched out in the book I have discussed at length is the only one in that period.
So let's get into Origen, shall we? So Origen, whom you say drank deeply from the wells of Platonic philosophy. You say that a couple of times in here. I wonder what Mark Edwards would say if he read that quote.
Yes, I wonder what he would say after a few drinks.
Let's see here. I got a quote on First Principles, Book 1, Section 1. Origen's immediate polemical context. And here your central thesis really is that Origen provided a via media, a middle way between two what he would have considered extreme views. The monarchian view, which would seem to boil down the three persons into just one. So you have the one person of the God. But then you also have the dualism of the Gnostics. Quote, this is from On First Principles, Book 1, Paragraph 1. Quote, many have produced lengthy discussions of God and his essence, so that, on the one hand, some have said that he has a bodily nature, which is composed of fine particles and is like ether. So it'd probably be like a Stoic position. But on the other hand, others have said that he is incorporeal. And still others have said that he is beyond essence in dignity and power. So 3 viewpoints. 1, God is composed of bodily parts. He's incorporeal, and that he's even beyond essence. Origen rejects the first one outright, but he seems to accept or at least welcome the other two. Can you, what is Origen getting at here? Who are his interlocutors? What's the context, basically?
I should mention that this passage appears in the section on First Principle 1:1, but is actually from Commentary on John. It wasn't very clear. Maybe perhaps on the page it says it's from the book 13 on the Commentary on John. In a famous.
Well, thank you for the correction right there.
It's useful to read Periodicon 1:1 in light of this section because it provides less details on these things.
This is in the section of book 13 where he's commenting on the verse "God is Spirit."
Correct, 4:24.
That's right, and he's the gospel, and he's going off on a little digression
That's
to explain how we interpret these three key biblical passages.
That's right. I think the style of the passage reads to me like a kind of lecture class, really, where he's expositing the different positions. I mean, in terms of the interlocutors, it's obvious, as you said, that he rejects all kind of materialistic interpretation of ousia, which has also been reproduced in his discussion on the term, on the Lord's Prayer, as you know, on prayer. And the two positions, this is the puzzle, and Origen scholars disagree on this, right? Whether he really Origen himself ascribes to the position of God being incorporeal, or rather beyond essence in dignity and power, which, you know, the famous Epikena, tes ousias of Plato's Republic, whether he ascribes himself to that position. As far as I can tell, Origen was within the context of philosophical discussions in Alexandria, where some of the original sources or inspirations for later Neoplatonic philosophy emerged. I have no personal preference for one or two Origen, so I'm not in that debate with Mark and Ilaria Ramelli and others. But I can surely say that Origen was conversant with those debates. I think I read this passage as a indication that this is an ongoing debate.
Yeah.
And from our point of view, which I think we can say that for Origen, he does recognize that certain options, like along materialistic lines, should be ruled out for the Christian philosopher. On our point of view, from the Christian point of view, we are still able to entertain these two options.
Yeah.
And so in places in Contra Celsum, I think he indicates that God's relationship with ousia can also be beyond ousia. So I think this is the way I interpret Origen's philosophical position. When we get to the Trinitarian theology, however, it becomes quite clear to me what he thinks about this. But we can go into this a bit later.
Yeah, well, you bring up this important debate about two origins, just so that people are aware. There's a scholarly debate about whether the origin of Eusebius in book 6 of his ecclesiastical history and the origin of Porphyry were the same origins, because they're debating whether Origen was, Eusebius says that he was born into a Christian family, raised a Christian the entire time, and he learned with he studied with Ammonius Saccas in Alexandria, Egypt, whereas Porphyry says no, Origen was a pagan, born into a pagan family, and later converted to Christianity. So there's these debates. Mark Edwards, on the one hand, says there's two origins. Ilaria Ramelli is like, no, there's one origin. How do you answer this? I don't know if there is a satisfactory answer given this evidence we have.
For the listeners, I mean, the reason why this is an important debate is simply to do with locating Origen in the history of philosophy. Yeah. And it's about this. Should watch the podcast on Hanukkah's Hellenization of Christianity.
Yes. Oh, you watched it. Good for you.
Well, yes, it's to do with the question of to what extent Christianity and Christian thinkers must be and can be aligned with the development of history of Greek philosophy.
Yeah.
And you know, as far as I can tell, if you have, I don't, that's why I don't have a position on this, because I feel you can do the same. You can locate Origen within the history of philosophy, either with two origins or one origin.
Yeah.
And
you know, I don't really have a position either, because I just think that the evidence that we have doesn't really, there's no smoking gun evidence one way or the other.
Yes,
we're dealing with a couple of people who wrote after or long after Origen died. There's a lot of polemics going on there, and we don't have anything from Origen himself that verifies one way or the other. But just the idea that if Origen was raised in a Christian family would not have precluded his opportunity to be well versed in the philosophical traditions. That's certainly true.
That's right.
So, okay. He's got these people in mind here in the John commentary, but on first principles, anyways, he's certainly dealing with monarchians and the Gnostics. Can you say a few things about that? What's the problem that Origen is trying to navigate, and how does he arrive at this via media?
So this is the main Christian doctrinal background that I spent quite a bit of time narrating, because in my reading of Origen, I see this background appearing everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, at around the early 3rd century, you have emerging and by that point actually polemical exchanges between writers who are anti-Gnostics, self-proclaimed, and various writers who could be classified as Gnostics, simply producing very elaborate metaphysical systems of emanation, which explains how reality, plurality and multiplicity of the cosmos that we live in emerged from a group of first principles. Some of them are monistic, some of them are more dualistic. And what happened, especially with regard to Trinitarian theology, is that in Irenaeus, Against Heresies, we find a very important discussion on the simplicity of God, which sets precedents for many later arguments reproduced by major Christian authors against what Irenaeus called Valentinian emanation. The Latin term is prolatio, Greek term is probole. And this process, according to Irenaeus, is the way in which the aeons in the Gnostic system. So the Gnostics believe that there are some first principles, and through some combinations, and in some accounts are explicit sexual relations, there is a reproductive process which allows more aeons to emerge, and these aeons they read symbolically into the scriptural text in order to justify the secret wisdom that they're presenting to their listeners. And this technical term, emanation, used by many polemical authors like Irenaeus and Origen, according to them, will violate the simplicity of God. And the argument simply is that if we have such accounts, which often draw on human birth analogy or animal generation analogy, then you have a kind of divine entity that can be splitted or divided in the way that human reproduction happens. You have division of matter. And what these writers argue, therefore, is that divine simplicity is a very important part for maintaining Christian doctrines against any kind of Gnostic systems. And here I must say that though I'm not a scholar of these Gnostic texts, I should flag up that it's been recognized very well by great scholars in the past, like Antonio Obey and others, that these arguments present very simplistic vision of Gnostic metaphysics. There's very little there's some attempts to present the details, but not very sympathetically. So I think it's worth noting that. But this is one important context. So simplicity emerges as an important tool, important weapon to identify an anti-Gnostic orientation in Christian belief. And that gets taken on later on in the 3rd century by Origen, and then in the 4th century, even Arius, defending his orthodoxy, would mention that his viewpoint does not commit to this mistake. So it's a kind of rhetorical strategy in the intra-Christian context that would be understood very well as a crucial one for why you want to maintain divine simplicity. So that's one side of the doctrinal background that I mapped out in the book in discussing Irenaeus, and also how Origen tackles the issue of the reproduction or the generation of the Logos.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of the doctrinal background, which is often only kind of flagged up in passing but not go into in detail, is the so-called monarchian controversy. And this is the series of debates that we have between perhaps late 2nd century. Those scholars debate about exactly when did it begin, late 2nd century, early 3rd century, where you have this debate about how to understand exactly the terms we should use to describe Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the Christian scriptures. In other words, what are the free of, and what are how does that square with a monotheistic belief? And the so-called monarchians, they got given the name Monarchia because of an important treatise by Tertullian, who called these figures monarchians, or who hold important doctrine of this single locus of power as a marker of monotheistic religion. Monarchians believe that the scriptural dialogues and the scriptural conversations, if you like, between what we might call the only God and Jesus, or figures that supposed to have claim to some form of divinity, the monarchians read all these dialogues as though a kind of monologue, at least according to their according to our polemical reports. So what we have here is a debate about really how to read scriptural dialogues between figures that have claims to divine status. Mm-hmm. And monarchians argue that there is no way we can introduce any fundamental plurality into this description, this descriptive account of what's going on in these scriptural dialogues. Mm-hmm. Whereas on the other hand, you have writers like Tertullian and most famously Origen, who argue that to maintain the integrity of the scriptural account, we must affirm with strong theological and language, but with philosophical technicality, we must strongly affirm a degree of plurality. So free personae, free persons, or free hypostasis, free subsistences, or something like that, will be required to maintain the integrity of scriptural dialogue. And I argue that in Origen's extant corpus, you find that whenever he talks about simplicity of God, and whenever he talks about Trinitarian relations, these two contexts are governing polemical contexts for his own position to be situated within. And I say a few things, further on about why this constitutes an important approach to read Origen, because it's entirely driven by his own 3rd century polemical concerns. And these are the writers we know from the reports of Eusebius of Origen's polemical concerns. He was concerned with monarchians or Sabellians. He was concerned with the Gnostics for sure, because of the famous debate with Heracleon, when he composed the commentary on John in Alexandria. So we know these contexts very well, and he also gives us reports. Origen himself, rarely, but in this case he did, provides reports of these polemical positions he recognized as deviant from Orthodox belief.
Mm.
I have a paper on this in the Journal of Theological Studies where I map out why I believe that this context is the most fruitful one for understanding some of Origen's theological moves that look like reproduction of later 4th century moves, but actually are much more embedded within a 3rd century context. So these two contexts, the anti-Valentinian or the anti-Gnostics context and the anti-monarchian context, are the two positions that Origen wanted to avoid in setting out a Christian theological vision of the Trinity.
So a number of issues are important there. One is the relation between doctrine and exegesis, because one of the things I think that separates these early Christians from Plato and some of the Middle Platonists, although the Middle Platonists were probably debating how to interpret Plato, so they're dealing with text too. But certainly for Origen, it's how do we interpret these stories in the Bible, which would seem to present a vision of God as one who's capricious and arbitrary and changes and lacks constancy. But there's also the incarnation, which is central to Christian teaching. That emerges in Contra Celsum, where, so this is somewhat related to exegesis as well, but also Celsus asks the Christians rhetorically, what kind of a God would take on human form? You know, that kind of suggests that your God is able to change, and our God is the one that's constant and lacks form and can't change, it's superior. You guys are kind of these childish little religious believers over here. How does Origen handle that question in Contra Celsum?
I think, yeah, so one thing I always often tell myself and my students is that it's not obvious when Origen in the 3rd century reading and teaching his students to read the scriptures, it is not obvious that we must imagine a kind of incorporeal bunch of incorporeal entities speaking as minds, disembodied, or it's obvious that they are a particular kind of metaphysical beings that we have come to, at least many people have come to recognize as the classical way that theists have read these texts. So I think this is a good way to situate us into Origen's concern. He's concerned with certain people, and some polemically outside of Christianity, but some I have pointed this out in chapter 5, perhaps even within Christianity. People have read this text as if the stories of incarnation and the story of the divine being taking on different forms and taking on body has implications for basically a materialistic notion of God. And following that chain of argument that Platonists have against materialists, thereby leading to a kind of notion of God that is not unchangeable. That's not, if from Platonist perspective, not ideally perfect. And in many ways, Origen is simply doing his duties to ensure that the Christians are well versed in the Platonist response to these arguments, and set out a hermeneutic where some of the scriptural text where God is described as fire or light or spirit, or terms where there could be a Stoic materialistic reading, or even just a simplistic anthropomorphic materialistic reading of the scriptural text. Origen is building a scriptural hermeneutic supported by the incorporeality and simplicity that's characteristics of a Platonist theology. That this is how you read this text. You read this text as if it contains a meaning that is not to be understood materialistically. There is a kind of a sense in which one can read this text and recognize that this is a simplistic and overly literal, and I think I can say this here in this context, way, which is not how these texts are meant to communicate the account of God. So in the contract custom, in those passages you mentioned, Origen simply produced a very dichotomized position of the Christians on the one hand and those who hold materialistic accounts on the other, which is a very polemical way of portraying his enemies. And then I said there that he's broadly aligned with some of the Platonist critiques of the time anyway, polemical critiques of the time. So he's not out of line here. But his main goal really is to ensure that scriptural texts have this hermeneutic that I was talking about, which obviously is a hermeneutic that we already find in Philo.
Mm-hmm. So he's going back to an important concept. He's providing a grammar of discourse, a grammar of exegesis, basically.
Yes.
So that when we have these theophanies, they should not be read in the sense that God is somehow changing in his form or in his substance. The fact that God becomes a human being in Jesus of Nazareth does not indicate a change somehow in God's substance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Indeed, I think one of the main questions that is one of the main points, theological points that have crystallized for me is that it is essential to these writers, and especially to Origen, that God's simplicity has to do with his unchangeability. Mm-hmm. And that unchangeability is a kind of incorruptibility that gets associated with incorporeal realities, like forms, etc. And I think it is important for them. And that's why one important question really is, can a doctrine of divine simplicity emerge outside of a framework where you don't have such metaphysics? And I mean, it has been shown, at length, that this also worked very well in Aristotelian metaphysics, especially in the context of Aquinas and others later on in the scholastics. And I think there's something important here, which is that I do recognize with contemporary scholars that to affirm divine simplicity, therefore, is to already to give quite a lot, a strong nod towards a particular framework, metaphysical framework in which we articulate a Christian theology. And it's very difficult to imagine if this basic distinction between incorporeals and corporeal and what does that entail, if we don't take them, it's very difficult to imagine what a doctrine of divine simplicity would mean, which is kind of, I take it as a lot of what contemporary scholars tend to ask from a contemporary philosophy point of view, which has a very different.
Let's get into that a little bit here before we wrap up. Origen is he'll frequently have these little kind of rhetorical questions for his audience, like what good does it do me, to know that this happened, in the book of Numbers, in his homilies in Numbers, I think he says something to this effect. What good does it do me to know that these things happened in history if it doesn't somehow affect my life? Or what good does it do me to know that the Logos was incarnate of Jesus of Nazareth if he also has not been made incarnate in me? What good does it do us? This is a $64 question here. Is there still relevance for this notion of divine simplicity today? I mean, should we still be talking about it?
Yes, and I think my answer to that question is, I kind of alluded to this about the connection between divine simplicity and the model of perfection that this entailed for these writers.
Mhm.
And I keep coming back to this theme because it's becoming clear to me that this theme has much larger significance than some of the developments I've mapped out in the book, which eventually was superseded in some ways in later theology. But this connection, I think, remains. The question we ask ourselves, or I ask myself, is if God is simple and God is this kind of basic, fundamental, sustaining reality upon which all things depend, then, first of all, how does that change my vision of perfection? Because that is what really is the point of articulating divine simplicity.
Mhm.
Simplicity means God is perfect. God is perfect in this particular way of lacking dependence. And I think this gets into all these debates, I think, about perfection, human perfection, and telos, and goal of flourishing, and goal of what does it mean to be living a flourishing life? Is it to be a kind of simple and being where there is no conflicting, there is no conflicting emotions and passions inside me? Is it to do with imitating a kind of life where I am entirely self-dependent? And here, this is the point where why some of the contemporary theologians don't like about simplicity.
Mm.
Is that it lacks a kind of relationality and dependence. When you think of simplicity this way, the ideal life is without dependence and relationality. This can't be right from an understanding of human flourishing. But I think here, again, it's why simplicity was articulated, why it's important to recognize simplicity was articulated in a Trinitarian context. In the context where the divine life, though really strictly speaking, one model is that in Origen's case, the Father is the simple being, and the Son and the Holy Spirit are dependent on the Father. And so in this case, the answer is very obvious. Human beings are imitating an ideal imitator of the simple life, who is the Son.
Mhm.
Human beings are not imitating the simplicity of the Father, but imitating the pure desire to imitate the simplicity of the Father found in the Son. That's one answer to the relationality problem. So therefore, this vision is not removing the relationality and dependence, but offering a new light onto how that works out in the context of human life. But I mean, I honestly think that this concept of simplicity as a marker of perfection and marker of human flourishing has a lot of potential for thinking about how we understand the value of meditation, the value of how psychologists these days describe what flourishing look like, and how it situates within some of those debates on human flourishing that's happening right now today. And this is not a concept that's often used. Yet, when you hear people describing a flourishing state, it often resembles quite a lot of the description of what we mean by the concept of simplicity, the concept of having a purity of mind, having a kind of groundedness that's within one's own source of life and being. And that is have this source of unchangeability that is not affected by those things going on around us. I mean, these are the kind of terms that you find a lot of people talking about. When you reach that state, there is a kind of sense of flourishing, a sense of steadiness, if you like. So, I mean, that is one way I would tackle the question of why divine simplicity still matters. I mean, the other question really is in terms of contemporary debates about the Christian understanding of God, because, as you well know, this is by no means closed in contemporary scholarship, but also within various Christian communities. And the classical view of God as incorporeal and simple is not really a dominant. I mean, I would I say dominant? I mean, it depends on what kind of context you're in. But I think it's up for debate.
Yes.
This
Absolutely.
view is a kind of preferred view by those who are Christian theists. And I think what I would say here is that what I hope the book does is to show that we really need to get back to historical reflections to tackle some of these ongoing debates, but also to recognize that these debates weren't purely metaphysical debates about the causal role and relation between God and the world. It's got a much deeper dimension to it that's connected to a whole framework. I think it was Khaled Anatolios who talks about this, that Trinitarian debates is about a whole vision of Christian life and perfection, and it has everything to do with everything, every single aspect of the Christian vision of life and flourishing. And that it's kind of what I find in these debates on simplicity. That's what these writers ultimately were concerned about. They're concerned about this vision of Christian flourishing and perfection that I think it's grounded upon their vision of divine simplicity.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to wrap up. I mean, it seems to me, our culture today is it's really imbibed. Western culture has really imbibed a kind of nihilism, and Nietzsche and Marx, kind of materialism, the will to power. There's no, and with postmodernism, people are critical of these claims to like objective truth or objective goodness. And it would seem to me that divine simplicity still reminds us, if we take this seriously, it reminds us that there is an objective good, a capital G good, after which we all strive. And if we lose that, we end up with this Nietzschean kind of nihilism where none of that really matters. It's just who has power to dictate the terms of the debate. I don't know. That's kind of, I've been thinking about this quite a bit because this is so, our culture is kind of been taken over by some of this stuff. I don't know, Pui, what you think about that.
If I write a book on simplicity and nihilism in 20 years' time, then you will be the person to blame.
Well, no, because if you write a book on simplicity and nihilism, I think I will brag that I'm the one who gave you the idea, because I think it's a book that needs to be written, Pui. It needs to be written.
And I'm sure you'll recommend all your podcast viewers to purchase that book. By the way, the book currently, back to this book, the book is certainly a worthwhile purchase and at a very low price, actually. I found today that it's only $20 on US Amazon and almost, I think, 52% off in the UK Amazon website. So this is the time to get it. If
this is the time to get it. Get it while it's hot.
Get some of the details about the arguments and the points that we were talking about.
Well, Pui, I think, yeah, I couldn't agree more. Go get yourself a copy of the book. It's worth it. This is an important discussion, not just for how we read the Church Fathers, but even for today. Pui, thank you very much for coming on to PatristiCast today. This was delightful.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed our conversation. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Until next time.